bought an engagement ring, but it came with this plastic box. Since I wanted to make something a little more personal, I started with some purple heart, just resawing it to get some thinner strips to use for the walls. Then I planed both pieces down to the same thickness. I took it over to the table saw to cut them to the correct width, and then I could start cutting the miters on the corners. I had cut a little piece of scrap wood that was roughly the size that I wanted to make the box, and that way I wouldn't have to rely on my poor measurement. I could just use that scrap wood for each piece. But once I had one piece cut, then I could actually use that as my reference piece and cut all the others to the same size. I numbered each of the edges so that I could make sure to put them against the right pieces, and then I checked the fit to make sure it looked good. With the walls looking good, I could then cut the bottom and top of the box. I used some CA glue on the miters because I wanted this to come together a little bit more quickly than regular wood glue. I also triple checked to make sure I was getting all the pieces joined in the correct way. And pressing them against a square, I could make sure each edge was correct and 90 degrees. And I ran into some frustration with the glue preferring to stick to my thumb instead of the wood, but eventually I started to get this to come together. As I was bringing all the joints together, one of the previous ones broke, and then the glue started sticking to my fingers and everything just got frustrating. So I stepped away, sanded down the miters again, and started to re-glue it. And that's when I realized that my cuts weren't perfect. So my miters were good, but the angle across that cut wasn't good. So the bottom of each piece was a little bit further in than the top, and that left some big gaps for the miters that weren't going together well. So I decided to cut my losses and start again doing a different technique. Eventually I'll probably just remake my little miter sled, but I didn't feel like doing that at this time, so I just cut some new pieces. Then I took an old scrap piece of 2x4 and I cut a groove in it that was the same thickness as the pieces of wood I had just cut, and then I put one of these scraps into that groove. I could use a flush trim saw to cut the bottom of that piece off, and then I could line everything back up with my dado stack. The idea here is that this piece sticking out represents one of the fingers in the box or finger joint, and the space between it and the blade is the exact same. So then you can just use it as a little key or notch and slowly move the pieces across. One of these days I'll make a proper jig for this, but this seems to work well for small projects. With all the fingers done, I could tap it into place and check the fit. It was actually extremely tight, so I ended up not needing to use any glue. And I used my random orbit sander to sand everything down, and I've got these new pads that go all the way up to 3000 grit, so it feels just super smooth and starts to even look reflective without any finish. Then I glued the bottom into place. It was a little bit finicky, but eventually I got it in there. When I was gluing the top into place, it was a bit tighter of a fit, so I ended up just kind of tapping it into place with my mallet. The next day after it had dried, I could take it over to the sander and just sand the walls of the box flush with the top and the bottom. And then I took it to the table saw so I could cut just a little bit off each of the corners. I didn't want these sharp corners, but I wanted to cut off a decent chunk of it so then I could take it back to my sander and kind of round over these edges. And I just did this by hand to give it a more organic feel. The bottom of the box I made ever so slightly rounded, and that was so that when it sat on the table, it would actually look like it was floating just a little bit above. It sounded like a good idea in my head, but I ended up not liking that as much. I took a marking knife to the box so I could mark off where I wanted all the cuts, and the idea was I was going to separate this at an angle, but I needed enough room on kind of either end of it so that it wouldn't fall apart. I should have planned this out a little bit better because one of my cuts goes through one of the teeth and causes that to break off, so there's just a little tiny piece missing, but I guess that adds to the character. I cut this apart with a handsaw, hoping that would give me a cleaner cut than using the bandsaw. I did kind of some bad camera work here, so it's a little bit off the screen, but you can get an idea of the two pieces here. Then I sanded down both of the pieces to make sure they would fit together really well, and unfortunately I broke the top out somehow, so I just took that over to my bench and scraped away the glue, and then I used CA glue to fix it. I also chipped just this little piece. It was kind of cracked across but didn't break off, so I could glue that back together with some CA glue and just holding that in place for a little bit. When I put the top back in place, I had to be careful not to push it too far through, and I let it sit for a while before I came back with the sander and kind of repeated all the grits. Then it was time to put in the hinge, and I did this terribly wrong, so don't do what I'm doing now. For some reason I was thinking if I epoxied it on the inside and lined up the hinge at 90 degrees, then this would work for the box. It very much does not work, so I had to redo this plan. Since that position wouldn't let the hinge actually open all the way, I realized I needed to just do the traditional position, which is to cut out just a little piece for the hinge to actually fit into. So I popped it off with one of my old crummy chisels, and then I marked off where I wanted the hinge and used my nicer chisels to actually make just a really tiny indentation here. I didn't have to use a mallet or anything. I was just peeling away the slightest bit. Since this wood was a little bit thin, I needed to cut down the hinge, and the easiest way was just with some tin snips. I could cut off just a little bit to make sure it would fit. Then it was back to the epoxy and getting the hinge in place. This was a little bit tricky because it was so small at this point, and I wanted to make sure the epoxy was only on the edges of the hinge and not getting into the part that needs to move. But eventually, with a little bit of patience and practice, I got it in there and it worked out well. With the hinge looking nice, my next thing to do was to figure out how to hold the ring in place. Sort of traditional boxes just have two cushions, but I thought it would be more interesting to have sort of a wooden finger that was sort of wearing the ring. And so I just kind of rounded over a dowel, cut it off, and then drilled a couple little holes into it to stick thinner dowels into. And then I could snip those off, and the idea was this dowel was roughly the right size of the finger, but then these thinner dowels sticking out from it would just hold it in place a little bit higher up on that artificial finger. And I couldn't help but draw a little smiley face on it. With it glued into place, I could get ready with the flocking. One of the things I've learned with this is to go relatively thin with this, so I usually start out and put a big clump of it in one part of the piece I'm working on, and then I kind of use that to spread around until I get it right. And then you just put a whole lot of flocking onto it, way more than is necessary. And then the next day you can come back and brush off some of the loose fibers. Once I peeled off the tape, then I could make sure I had a good clean edge. And I decided to make this little piece on the back that would kind of support the hinge. So the idea was it would go right under the hinge, and when the lid was completely open, it would rest against this little piece. And that way there wouldn't be any stress on the hinge that would end up breaking it. I just finished this off with some boiled linseed oil. That's quickly becoming one of my favorite finishes because it looks nice and it's really easy. Then I could put the ring into it and see how it looked. And she said yes.